Last night in Syria, a violent showdown along the country's coast, its future hanging in the balance. Ferocious fighting in places like Latakia meant for a time this felt like a country on the brink. In the most serious threat yet to President Ahmed al-Sharah's fledgling state, at least 130 people were killed. But it is probably many more as evidence of further sectarian killings continues to emerge. Here is how it unfolded. Yesterday, 16 security personnel were killed in a series of well-coordinated ambushes by pro-Assad loyalist gunmen. In one attack, at least 5 government soldiers were surrounded, rounded up and executed. A pro-Assad fighter took to social media with a message of no surrender.
They are begging us to surrender, but we will not surrender.
The reaction convoys from across the country arrived in droves to put down what was looking like an insurrection. Fighting spread into the mountains around Latakia, where the former regime general who orchestrated this is thought to be based. A government helicopter gunship was deployed there. Fighting broke out in other parts of the country too. These were the scenes in Homs. Parallel to all this, thousands demonstrated, including here in Damascus, a show of support for the interim government's security forces. After prayers, a large Sunni congregation took to the streets today. This is a show of support for the government, basically, against this backlash we've seen in coastal areas. As you can see, there is quite a heavy government security presence on the ground here. The fear, of course, is that this military conflict isolated in the coast could evolve into sectarian clashes on the streets. Then this afternoon, images started to emerge showing groups of men dead in the streets in Alawite villages around Latakia, suggesting that people's worst nightmare was being realized. Syria's Interior Ministry released a statement this evening acknowledging, quote, individual crimes committed by groups of gunmen outside government control. An admission, in other words, that something terrible had happened on the ground here. Damascus says it has successfully contained the offensive by remnants of Assad's regime on the coast. The big question now, at what cost and for how long?
And Porrick joins us live now from Damascus. Porrick.
We spent much of this evening reaching out and speaking to reliable sources in those Alawite villages around the city of Latakia. And we can confirm that scores of civilians were murdered in sectarian attacks last night and this morning. They include women and probably children. Now, the interim government here says those violations, as they describe them, were perpetrated by militants outside of their control, as you heard in my report, that they were piggybacking basically on a military offensive directed at pro-Assad regime forces. But I suppose what this ultimately speaks to is while the interim president, Ahmed al-Sharah, may be in control of some of the men in uniforms, he is not in control of all of the men with guns.
Porrick O'Brien in Damascus. Well, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Charles Lister, Syria Programme Director at the Middle East Institute think tank. Let's take each group separately, first of all. I mean, in terms of the fighters loyal to HTS, is it credible that they are not under control of the government and that they're just doing this off their own bat?
First off, thanks for having me. And second, it's a complicated picture, to be honest. The situation that developed last night took place very, very quickly amidst plenty of chaos. There was a small number of security forces already deployed in Latakia in this particular region. They were already being swamped by the hostilities that resulted from these attacks by loyalist forces. But what happened was that mass protests developed all across Syria yesterday in support of the interim government, and men, literally thousands of men, literally just picked up their arms. They're not in the army, they're not in militias. They picked up weapons, got in their cars, and drove to the northwest of the country, to the Mediterranean coast. And that is the kind of complex dynamic that took place in the middle of the night. And there are photos out there of the highway just being completely clogged with civilian vehicles as men took up to the north of the country, many of them, as you say, quite likely in an attempt to exact revenge. Those fighters, or those men, were unquestionably outside of the command of the interim government. And I think probably the question is to what extent they're able to control that particular dynamic now, as the fighting is still raging.
Now, what about the other side? I mean, because there were attacks on government forces by militants loyal to the old Assad regime. How organised are they and how armed?
So yes, I mean, as your package said, the initial reports were that 16 government soldiers had been killed. My understanding is that it's in the dozens. So it was an extremely significant spike in coordination in these attacks last night. I mean, certainly I've been tracking, these attacks have been happening for weeks. And if you chart them on a graph, they've been slowly ticking up week by week. But yesterday was an absolutely, huge surge, both in terms of the scale and the sophistication. And more or less what we saw was about a dozen attacks being launched simultaneously in multiple different areas. And they pinned down government forces on all of the main roads throughout the region. And then as reinforcements were sent, loyalists had snipers positioned on the surrounding mountains to take out those convoys as they arrived. So it was a highly sophisticated operation, and there is increasing evidence that Iran or elements linked to Iran have played a role here. There was sophisticated communications equipment seized last night. Communications were intercepted, spreading to other regions of Syria. And the overall commander of this whole operation was a very senior Assad regime official in the 4th Division, which had long been Iran's primary arm in the Assad regime's military apparatus.
Right. So I mean, now obviously this particular area around Latakia is different to the rest of Syria. If the fighting there continues, what is the chance of it spreading further into the rest of Syria?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the big worry. So I was there just a few weeks ago, and I have to say, one of the things that struck me most when I was in Latakia and speaking to people from all across that province was that they were too, as Syrians all across the country, elated that the regime had gone and that they were sort of breathing the air of freedom once again. At the same time, they were extremely concerned that thousands of their young men, young Alawite men, had been essentially expelled from the newly dissolved Syrian Arab army, the army that Bashar al-Assad had commanded, and that these young men were basically stuck, bored in the mountains, in rural areas with nothing else to do. And as I heard from mothers of some of these men, they were concerned not necessarily that their sons had sectarian ideas in their head, but that they would fall prey to those who did.
Charles?
And fast forward 3 weeks, that may very well be what's happening now.